Cool. Yeah, so when I was first told by Luke that we were doing a series on fruits of the Spirit, to be honest, I was really excited about it. I really love the fruit of the Spirit. I think there is a lot of good stuff to be got out of it. So much good content, so many good learnings to be had. And so when Luke asked me to preach, I was really excited. I hope I get one of the good fruits, give me love. Come on, give me all joy. I'll have joy. I got gentleness, which I think, to be honest, gentleness is probably the fruit that we hold in the lowest regard of all of the fruits of the Spirit. If we were to make a list, our rankings of all the fruits of the Spirit, I think gentleness would probably be dead last for most of us. It's not, we don't often sing songs, great is thy gentleness, or gentleness to the world. That's not the one. And actually, when we encourage each other, I don't know the last time, maybe this is more a reflection on me, but I don't know the last time somebody said, "Oh, Michael, your gentleness is really encouraging." I'm not sure I've ever heard that. Maybe I need to be more gentle. Maybe that's the message. But yeah, I think we treat gentleness as sort of the nice to have fruit of the Spirit, sort of the consolation prize out of the fruits. And as I was preparing for this evening, I was really struck that is not the way that the gospel writers view gentleness. If you look at Paul on his own, he writes on 15 different occasions to encourage people to be more gentle. It is really front and center of Paul's message to various different churches to be gentle in what you're doing. In fact, when Paul writes to Timothy, he says that gentleness is a qualification for leadership. If you're not gentle, then actually you're not qualified to lead. That it's not a nice to have, it's a non-negotiable for Christians. It's a really important fruit for us to engage with. And I think really that a lot of our apathy apathy towards gentleness probably comes from a bit of a misunderstanding of gentleness and what it is. So what I'm hoping to do this evening is to sort of spend probably the first half of the session just talking about a couple of what I think are the mistakes and the myths around gentleness, things that we get wrong. And what we're going to do is we're gradually going to move to a position where we can define what do we think, or what do I think godly gentleness looks like. And so that's kind of the big question. What does it look like to be godly and gentle, godly gentleness? And then we're going to sort of use Paul as an example and sort of see that in practice to finish. So hopefully that sounds all right. If it doesn't, it's too late to change it now. So, can we, I don't know whether I can do it here.
You can't.
I can't do it here. So, Nigel, can we get the first one up? Yeah, so the first myth that I want to just talk about a little bit, and to be honest, this is primarily, I think, a myth that is in the world rather than in the church, but it's the idea that gentleness is actually weakness. And I think particularly in certain areas of life, there is this view that actually gentleness it's not a benefit, it's a bad thing. And particularly, maybe the workplace or in politics, there's not many people in politics who, you go to the House of Commons, they're not all being gentle to one another, are they? They're all shouting, because that is the impression that we are given. That's what good leadership looks like. It looks like somebody who has a vision and will go for it regardless of what anyone else is saying. Compromise has become a bit of a dirty word in politics. You can't compromise with somebody. But actually, there's very little room left for gentleness in our politics. There's very little room left for compromise. Similarly, I don't know if anyone's watched The Apprentice, but you don't, when they all go into the boardroom and they're all sat opposite Alan Sugar, they're not all being, I thought you did really well actually on this task. Yeah, you were brilliant. You were, they all go at each other, don't they? That's because that's what business looks like. It's the cut and thrust of business. And actually, if you're gentle, you're probably not right for this position. It's not right for you. If you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen. Gentleness is not seen as a real benefit. It's seen as weakness. If you display your gentleness, well, actually somebody will go for you. And actually, the view that we're presented with in Scripture is not at all that view of gentleness. And so I've got 1 Kings here, 19, 11 through 13, and I'll just read it. So I think it's a really great example of what godly gentleness looks like and what God's gentleness looks like. And so the context of this is Elijah is being chased by Jezebel, and he's having a really bad time, and he's really frustrated with God. And so it starts, and he said, and it's God. So God said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains, and broke into pieces the rock before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak, and went out and stood at the entrance to the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And I think there's a couple of things that really are striking about this passage. The first is how gently God approaches Elijah. But the second is that God's not doing it because this is as much as God can muster. You know, God's not speaking in a whisper because actually he's a long way away. He's not speaking in a whisper because that's all the strength he can muster. Because he's just passed through with the fire and the earthquake. That's all from God. You know, God has all of that strength. It's not a necessity that means that God speaks in gentleness. It's actually a desire that God speaks in gentleness. You know, it comes from God's strength, and actually it's through strength that gentleness can be displayed most effectively. I was kind of thinking about this idea of strength being how gentleness is displayed, and I've got this example. It'll show you how my brain works. If we can go on to the next slide. Right, so I don't know if anyone knows who these people are. This person on the left is a guy called Eddie Hall. He used to be world's strongest man. He's a real tough guy. The guy on the right, he's gonna be a really handsome, funny, good-looking guy when he's older. Hopefully. So that's me, age 2. So if you were to put these two guys into the wrestling ring and say, right, fight one another, I don't think there's many people who'd be going, "Oh, Michael, make sure you're gentle with Eddie. You know, don't go too hard on him." But there'll be lots of people who are really worried about Eddie and saying to Eddie, "You've got to be gentle here." It's not the person who is weak who's the one who needs to be gentle or needs to display gentleness. It's the one who is strong. And actually, if I in my 2-year-old might was to decide I'm going to be gentle to Eddie here, you probably wouldn't even notice the difference. Let's be honest. You know, you wouldn't see it. But if Eddie decided not to be gentle, you'd notice it pretty quickly, wouldn't you? So first myth, gentleness is weakness. Well, that's not the gospel message. The gospel message is actually gentleness is a choice that comes from somebody with strength. And actually, I think it's worth saying, that is what we saw in Romans, you know, a few weeks ago, where we looked at, you know, the weak and the strong in the church. And the message was, look, if you're one of the strong guys in the church, actually look after the guys who are weaker. Don't become a stumbling block for them. That is, you know, one really good example of this gentleness that Paul is talking about. So the second myth is the myth, and I think this one's probably more pervasive within the church, if I'm honest. If the other one is something that is outside the church, this one is probably more inside the church, and not specifically our church, but the church. And the idea is gentleness is passiveness. So basically, the logic here goes something like this. Well, okay, if in order to be gentle, I need to be strong but not use my strength, then in order to be very gentle, I just won't use my strength. You know, unless it directly affects me, I will keep my hands off. I won't cause conflict. I won't ruffle any feathers. I will just keep myself to myself. I will stay out of every situation, and that will be my way of showing, actually, I'm a really gentle guy. And on face value, that can seem like quite a good thing. Blessed are the peacemakers. That sounds like a really godly principle. The issue I think that we have is that is not always the demonstration that Christ gives us, let alone what others in the gospel give us. So just to kind of give an illustration of this one, I've got what I think is one of Jesus's best examples of gentleness, a really clear example of Jesus' gentleness, which is in John chapter 8, verses 3 through 11. Again, I'll read it. This one's across 2 slides, and so you might have to click halfway through. So it says, "The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, 'Teacher, this woman has been caught in an act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commands us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?' This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, 'Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her.' And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." See, this is a really good example of Jesus' gentleness, but it's not a really good example if you're looking for passive gentleness. You know, if Jesus was passive in this situation, it would have gone very differently. If Jesus had gone, "Well, it's not for me to get involved in this. You just do whatever you think is right according to the law of Moses." Well, actually, Jesus stepped in this situation, and actually, I think it's really relevant that Jesus is given two opportunities to be passive. The first of which is to say, "Well, I won't do anything. I won't interfere with what's going on. I'll leave the religious leaders to deal with this lady." But the second of which is to not address the sin that is in the lady. And I think probably most of us would like to think we wouldn't do the, we'd look after the lady, but most of us probably would shy away from the second one. It's quite uncomfortable sometimes to address people's sin. It's sometimes uncomfortable to challenge people. And I think it's really important that Jesus ends by saying, "Now go, and from now on sin no more." It's a recognition that actually there is something wrong here. There is a sin to be dealt with. And I think it could very easily be that little bit Jesus didn't do. And it might read like actually Jesus is saying, adultery is okay. But by addressing the sin, Jesus really deals with that problem. So, and actually, I think just one last point on this gentleness is passiveness. And I think Isaiah gives a really helpful verse just to kind of hit home that we're not called to be passive. It's Isaiah 1 verse 17, and it says, "Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." That's not a call to be passive. That's not a call to kind of claim gentleness and therefore say it's not my problem, it's somebody else's problem. We're not called to do that. Actually, we are called to use the power that God has given us. So it then raises the question, well, okay, if godly gentleness isn't weakness and it's not passiveness, then what does godly gentleness look like? And I kind of grappled with this question for a couple of weeks, really. Nigel, if you can go on to the next slide. The next one again, sorry. And wait for one more. Perfect. So what is godly gentleness? And I think the impression that we sometimes have of godly gentleness, we've got this great example in Jesus. And this is kind of the typical image that we've got of Jesus. He's welcoming the children, and he's just being really loving to everyone, and he's feeding 5,000, and he's caring for everyone. But actually, as I was preparing, I was kind of struck, well, that is the image that we get of Jesus, but we also get this image of Jesus. We get the image of Jesus throwing over the tables in the temple. And actually, if Jesus is an example of gentleness, that gave me a real issue. How can God be gentle and at the same time be tipping over the temple, the tables in the temple? So I sort of grappled with this and sort of was questioning God for quite a while on this, really, just trying to understand, well, where is your gentleness in this situation, God? And really, God answered me through a series of 3 questions that I'll sort of talk you through here, which I think helped me, so hopefully they'll help you as well. So the first question was, did I have the right to do what I did? So, Michael, did I have the right to do what I did? And I sort of thought about it and said, well, God, I guess you had the right to do it. You are the great high priest, and it was in the temple, and the high priest has the right to deal with the temple as he sees fit. And more than that, you are the Son of God, and it's your Father's house, and so you have the right to do what you want in your Father's house. So, okay, God, you had the right to do it, but I'm still not sure it feels gentle what you did. And the second question was, okay, did my actions have a righteous outcome? I said, well, okay, I guess it did, Lord. By doing what you did, the temple was cleared and it was made once again a place where people could pray, and the space was moved out. So yes, it had a righteous outcome. But still, God, I'm left with this frustration of, it doesn't feel gentle. Where's the gentleness in it? And really the answer to that came in the third question, where God asked me, well, okay, what else could I have done? And this was a really interesting question for me to grapple with. And I sort of went, okay, maybe you can could you have just talked to them? Could you just say, oh, sorry fellas, do you mind just awfully if you just do set up your stalls outside? Is that okay? And he said, well, okay, I accept, God. That's not a great option. That probably wouldn't have worked. But maybe you could have appealed to the authorities, got the authorities to move them. Except I know that the Romans weren't really interested in what was happening in the temple, and the Jewish authorities were profiting from it. So, okay, I accept that there's not a solution there. And I sort of racked my brains, and I thought for a while, okay, what is the solution to this? And in the end, I had to come back and say, okay, God, I can't think of another way to clear the temple. I can't think of another way that you could have done it. And so I'll concede on this one. And God's response to me went something like this. He said, Michael, I'm the Son of God. I have an army of angels at my back. I breathed, and 200 billion trillion stars came into existence, each one of them creating the power of millions of nuclear bombs in a single second. And you're upset with me because I turned over a table in order to drive out thieves from my father's house. I sort of, yeah, I suppose that is why I'm upset with you, God. I do see things, and suddenly I'm sort of back to the toddler analogy before, with a slight twist, where I was the toddler and God is this all-powerful being who can do anything. And suddenly I realised, well, actually, what we see in this story, and it, to be honest, it completely transformed my reading of this story, because I've always seen it as, this strange example of righteous anger, but I sort of, for the first time, God opened my eyes to the idea that actually this is a story about Jesus doing the minimum that he possibly could in order to achieve the outcome that was required. He could have done so much more in order to clear that temple. He could have cleared it so easily. He could have exercised so much power, but he chose to just flip a couple of tables and say, go on, out you go. And as I was kind of reflecting on that, I thought, what, that to me is what biblical gentleness looks like. And I think I've said it on the next slide. Sort of my definition of biblical gentleness is exerting the minimum pressure possible in order to achieve a godly outcome. And I found that really helpful to sort of think of it in those terms. And actually, because sometimes we do need to exert some pressure. Sometimes we are called into a situation, but in all situations, we should say, look, how do we do this as gently as possible? How do we do this exerting as little pressure as we possibly can? And these three questions, I think, are a really good starting point in terms of if you're in a situation, just ask yourself those three questions. Do I have the right to do this? Is it something that God has prohibited me doing? Will my actions drive a righteous outcome? And am I exerting the minimum pressure in order to achieve my goals? So I just sort of, in finishing, I wanted to give an example of this in practice, or where we can kind of see this clearly at work. And so we're going to go to 1 Thessalonians 2. This one is not on the screen, so feel free to find it in your Bibles. I will read it. I think I'm reading from the ESV. So it's 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 to 12. And Nigel, can we just get the next slide? As we read through it, I would encourage you to ask these three questions. Number one, does Paul have the right to burden the Thessalonians? Number two, will his actions drive a righteous outcome? And number three, how does he exert the minimum pressure in order to achieve his goals? Okay, those three questions. So I will read it for us. For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please men, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children, so being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labour and toil. We work day and night, that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct towards you believers. For you know how, like a father with a child, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. So this is Paul setting himself up and saying, look, guys, in the way I behave with you, I'm a good example of gentleness. And so just talking through these three questions. Number one, does Paul have the right to be a burden to the Thessalonians? Well, Paul thinks he does. So he says in verse 6, we could have made demands of you as apostles of Christ. So Paul's saying yes. In fact, in other verses, in I think it's Timothy, he talks about a worker being worth his wages, and Paul sees himself as a worker of Christ. So yes, he has the right to be a burden to the believers. Now, did Paul have a righteous objective? Again, yes. His work is to further the gospel of God. We proclaim to you the gospel of God. That's his objective. So if you just took those two questions, you say, well, okay, there's no problem in being a burden to the Thessalonians. That's fine. But this third question is the one that really pulls out the gentleness, because when Paul asks himself that question, he says, well, okay, how do I exert the minimum pressure in order to achieve this goal? And what you see is that Paul ends up relinquishing some of the rights that he has in question 1. So he has the right to make demands as an apostle. He chooses not to, because actually there is a way of him achieving his objective to proclaim the gospel, which causes less difficulty and exerts less pressure to the people in Thessalonica. And so, he gives the example, working night and day so as not to become a burden to you, sharing their whole selves with the church and exhortation with encouragement. So we can see there clearly that actually Paul makes an active decision that other people and their benefits should be prioritised over his own rights. And again, you see that from a position of strength. Paul comes in with the rights, he has the strength, but he chooses the gentleness and he chooses to bless others. And I think it's probably worth just mentioning in finishing these three questions, which I've sort of said I think are quite a useful framework for decision making. They're sometimes really difficult to answer. Will my actions drive a righteous outcome? That's a really difficult question to answer sometimes. What is the minimum pressure I can exert in order to achieve this goal? Really, really difficult question to answer. And I think it's really important to remember that these are fruits of the Spirit. These are not fruits of good people. These are not things that we can do in our own strength and with our own wisdom. These are things that come through God and through God's wisdom. And so in all of this, I think we should be looking at this with a heart of humility and saying, actually, we need God's help in this. We need God's help to identify how do we exert minimum pressure. We need God's help to identify how do we drive righteous outcomes to the situations that we're facing at work, with our family, with our kids. So I've stuck a couple of questions on the next slide, hopefully. So I've left the three at the top, which are sort of the three questions, but these ones in the white area underneath are the ones that I think would be good to chat in tables. So the questions are, first of all, when making decisions, which of the three questions above do you find the most challenging to answer? And probably along with that, another way of asking the same question is, which of those do we need God's help with the most? Which of those do you need God's help with the most? Question 2, in what areas is there a temptation to be too passive, to not use the power that God's given us and to just say, it's nothing to do with me, I'll leave it? And question number 3, how could you be more gentle in your relationships and evangelism? Now that's a difficult question, challenging question, but I think it's useful to get right down to the practical stuff, rather than to keep it quite vague. And so really try to grapple with that one and think of some really practical stuff that we can do. And then if you finish all that, pray. Cool, thanks.